Something is happening right now in a stretch of frozen ground in the Yukon that nobody outside a small circle of miners was ever supposed to know about. And once you hear the details, you'll understand why they tried so hard to keep it quiet. For months, a veteran gold miner named Griff Halloran has barely said a word to the press, barely posted online, and barely shown his face at any of the usual mining meetups. People assumed he was just having a slow season. They were wrong. According to several people close to the operation, Griff has spent the last year quietly building what insiders are now calling the most ambitious placer mining project ever attempted in that part of the Yukon. Before we get into what was found underground, hit subscribe because what this crew uncovered is going to change how people think about gold mining in this region for a long time. For years, Griff Halloran was known as a solid, hardworking miner, but never the kind of name that made headlines. He ran a mid-sized operation, kept his crew small, and stayed out of the spotlight. He wasn't a guy giving interviews at industry events or showing up in mining documentaries. He was the guy who quietly hit his numbers season after season, paid his crew on time, and went home before anyone thought to ask him what he was working on next. That reputation is part of why nobody saw this coming. That all changed quietly over the course of a single winter, when he started buying up leases on ground that every other miner in the valley had written off as worthless. Old-timers in the area will tell you that stretch of land had a reputation. Too deep, too expensive to reach, and never worth the diesel it would take to move enough dirt to find out what was underneath. Griff apparently disagreed. Sources familiar with the deal say he spent nearly 2 years negotiating access to those claims, and by the time the ink dried, he had quietly assembled more ground than most companies in the region control combined. What makes this story even stranger is how it started. A retired geologist who used to consult for several Yukon operations reportedly ran an old set of core samples through updated equipment almost as a favor, not expecting to find anything unusual. Instead, the readings came back showing gold concentrations that didn't match anything on record for that stretch of ground. The numbers were run again, then a third time. Each time, the results held. Whatever was sitting under that frozen dirt wasn't behaving like a normal placer deposit. And that discovery is what reportedly convinced Griff to bet nearly everything he had on ground that everyone else had walked away from. People who know him say he sat on that report for almost 3 months before making a single call, weighing whether it was worth risking a business he'd spent 15 years building on the word of one unusual set of samples. By the time he finally made his move, Griff wasn't just leasing a single claim. He was reportedly negotiating for access to an entire stretch of river valley that had been split up among smaller landholders for decades, none of whom had ever seriously tried to work the deeper ground. Piecing that land together meant dozens of individual conversations, some of them reportedly taking months to close, and at least 2 landholders initially turned him down outright, convinced the ground wasn't worth the trouble of negotiating over. Griff kept coming back. By the following spring, he had control of the whole stretch, and almost nobody in the valley realized what had just happened until equipment started rolling in. The scale of what followed is hard to overstate. Reports from people who worked on the early setup describe 5 separate work sites spread across the claim, each one built out with its own wash plant, its own excavators, and its own crew housing. More than 150 workers were reportedly brought in over the course of a single season, split into rotating shifts so that machines could keep running around the clock. Fuel trucks were making runs into the site almost daily, hauling enough diesel to keep generators, heaters, and heavy equipment going through temperatures that regularly dropped well below freezing. One former contractor who helped haul equipment into the site described it as looking less like a mining claim and more like a small industrial town had been dropped into the middle of nowhere overnight. Roads that hadn't seen regular traffic in years were suddenly being graded and widened just to keep the supply runs moving. Setting up a camp of that size and that kind of terrain came with its own set of headaches long before a single test pit was dug. Water had to be sourced and treated for a crew that size. Housing had to be winterized well, beyond what a normal seasonal operation would need. Communication out there is spotty at best. So a small satellite relay system was reportedly installed just so the different sites could stay in contact with each other and with a main camp. None of that shows up in the gold totals at the end of the season, but people who were involved in the early build-out say it ate up weeks of time and a substantial chunk of the budget before the crews ever touched pay dirt. The drilling itself is where things start to get genuinely strange. Standard placer operations rarely need to go past the first 20 or 30 feet before hitting bedrock or exhausting the pay layer. Griff's crews were reportedly pushing drill targets past 100 feet, chasing what geologists on site started referring to as a buried channel system, essentially an ancient riverbed that had been covered over by thousands of years of sediment. The theory was that gold carried by that ancient river had settled and concentrated far deeper than anyone in the area had ever bothered to look. It was an expensive and proven idea, and more than one experienced miner reportedly told Griff directly that he was risking everything on a theory that had never been tested at that scale in that region. Drilling that deep in permafrost isn't like drilling anywhere else. The ground fights back at every stage, and rigs that would chew through normal soil in an afternoon can take days to push through frozen, rocky overburden. Money, unsurprisingly, became the biggest source of tension almost immediately. Setting up 5 sites simultaneously meant the operation was burning through cash before a single ounce of gold had been recovered. Equipment alone reportedly ran well into 8 figures, and that number doesn't include the ongoing costs of fuel, wages, repairs, and the kind of emergency maintenance that frozen ground always seems to demand. Hydraulic lines crack in extreme cold. Engines struggle to turn over. Parts that would last years in a milder climate wear out in weeks. Every single breakdown meant lost production time, and lost production time meant money disappearing with nothing coming back in return. More than one person close to the operation admitted they weren't sure Griff would make it through the season without running out of capital. One equipment supplier, speaking on condition of anonymity, said Griff had put in the largest single equipment order they'd processed from an independent operator in years, and that the size of it alone raised eyebrows across the whole supply chain. Then came the technology angle, which is part of what has people in the industry talking. Instead of relying purely on instinct and old-fashioned test pits the way most placer operations still do, Griff's team reportedly brought in ground-penetrating sensors and drone-based mapping to build a real-time picture of what was sitting underground before committing to a dig site. That data was fed into a central system that helped the crew decide where to move equipment next, cutting down on the guesswork that normally eats up weeks of a short mining season. It's not the kind of setup you'd expect to see on a small independent claim, and it's part of why some in the industry have started describing this operation as more of a modern engineering project than a traditional gold rush dig. A young engineer who joined the crew mid-season reportedly said the operation felt more like something out of an oil exploration company than a placer mine, with maps updating in near real time and drilling decisions being made off data instead of gut instinct alone. The first real test of all that investment came when the wash plants finally started processing material from the deepest test cuts. According to people present that day, there was a noticeable tension in the room as the first cleanup mats were pulled and rinsed. Nobody wanted to say out loud what they were hoping to see, because too much had already been spent for false hope to make the disappointment any easier. When the concentrate hit the pan, several crew members reportedly went quiet. The gold sitting in that first cleanup was heavier than anything the site had produced in early test digs, and by most early estimates, it pointed toward a season that could dramatically outperform what that ground had ever been expected to produce. One long-time crew member reportedly had to sit down for a minute after seeing the pan, saying it was the first time in over a decade of mining that a single cleanup had actually caught him off guard. Word travels fast in a small mining community, and it wasn't long before other operators in the region started asking questions. A few respected veteran miners reportedly made the trip out to see the site for themselves, skeptical that a claim written off as worthless for decades could suddenly be producing numbers like this. What they found, according to those who were there, was hard to argue with. Wash plants running nonstop, real-time data being tracked across every site, and gold showing up in quantities that made it clear this wasn't a fluke. Even miners who came in doubting the whole project reportedly left admitting they'd underestimated what Griff had built. One veteran operator, who has run claims in the region for close to 20 years, reportedly told a friend afterward that he wished he'd looked twice at that ground himself before writing it off years earlier. As word kept spreading, so did the speculation. Some in the industry started running rough estimates of what a season like this could be worth if the deeper zones held up the same way the early test cuts had. Nobody wanted to put a firm number on it publicly, because everyone in this business has seen promising early numbers fall apart once an operation moves from a handful of test holes to full-scale production. Ground that looks incredible in a 5-yard sample can thin out fast once you're moving thousands of yards a day. Griff himself, according to people close to him, has reportedly stayed cautious in private conversations, refusing to let anyone on the crew get ahead of themselves before the deeper zones are fully proven out. None of this has come without real risk, and it's important not to gloss over that part of the story. Extreme weather remains one of the biggest threats to the entire operation. A single bad storm can shut down roads needed to bring in fuel and supplies, and in an operation running 5 sites at once, even a short delay can ripple through the whole season. Equipment failure is a constant threat as well, especially with machines being pushed to run continuously in brutal cold. And there's the simple financial reality that an operation this large has an enormous amount riding on every single week of production. If the deep channel theory had turned out to be wrong, or if the gold had thinned out after those first promising cuts, the losses could have been severe enough to end Griff's mining career entirely. A few people who worked closely with him during the build-out said there were nights early in the season when the whole project genuinely felt like it could collapse under its own cost before it ever had the chance to prove itself. There's also the human side of a project this size that doesn't always make it into the headlines. Running 5 sites around the clock means asking a crew to push through exhaustion, freezing conditions, and long stretches away from home, all while carrying the knowledge that the entire season's success rides on machines that could break down at any moment. A few crew members reportedly left partway through the season, unable to keep up with the pace. The ones who stayed talk about it now with a strange mix of pride and disbelief, like they went through something they're still not entirely sure how to explain to people who weren't there. That's part of what makes this story worth paying attention to. This isn't a guaranteed success story being told after the fact with all the risk safely removed. It's an ongoing gamble built on a theory that hadn't been proven at this scale in this part of the Yukon, backed by an amount of money and equipment that put everything on the line. The early results are genuinely promising, and the technology being used is genuinely ahead of what most operations in the region are doing. But placer mining has humbled bigger operations than this one before, and there's still a full season of frozen ground, unpredictable weather, and mechanical strain left to get through before anyone can call this a true success.